Thank you very much.
Thanks for warning me.
Just want to warn everyone, but now that we're a little after the hour. So hi everyone, thanks for joining us for another CMP mini webinar. More like a regular webinar now, because we've been doing so many of these, and we've been able to do longer time periods, which has been great. There's a poll that should be popping up on your screen. It's 3 questions, so you might need to scroll down slightly and for you to be able to answer all of the questions. And we'll share the results of that after everyone has finished taking the poll. But just some house rules is this is being recorded so that we can post it on the CMP YouTube channel, and that recording will be shared with you and with everyone else in the community after it's been posted. Just takes me a few days to get it up usually. So look for an email from me afterwards with that recording, and also with any information that the hosts of this webinar would like to share with you following it. And yeah, so welcome to our Navigating the Post-COVID World, Building Political Awareness into Effective Adaptive Management webinar. I'm excited to hear from our hosts today. And it looks like we have 14 out of 16 have voted, so that seems pretty good. There'll be people that trickle in throughout, so I'll continue to keep letting them in, but I will share the results of this poll now, just because we have almost everybody. So you should see the results on your screen. Yep.
And maybe I'll just jump in before Will kicks us off to say this is exciting. It looks like we've got a lot of folks who are going to be brand new to thinking and working politically, although at least a couple folks who think about it every day. And then not surprisingly, good familiarity with situation models and results chains, although a few folks who these concepts will be new for them as well. So thanks for sharing a little bit about your background and familiarity on that.
Great, thank you, Kelsey. So hopefully, Sarah, you can see my screen. Looking all right?
Yes, everything looks good.
Everything looks good. All right. Well, let's get going then. So you'll see the agenda there. We just talked about the poll results, and thanks everybody for joining today. It's really good to see you. I know there are lots of people for whom this time zone doesn't work, so you'll be watching the recording, but I hope you also enjoy it for those of you who are watching later. So just to cover the objectives and why we're doing this, well, and I hope you appreciate the snappy title. I know it was a little bit long-winded. It wasn't easy to come up with a title, but really there is strong evidence that political factors are a key driver of biodiversity loss, and that thinking and working politically really does make a difference. It makes a difference to the effectiveness of our programming, the resilience of organizations, the way we think about risk and opportunities. And of course, we're aware of the pandemic. We were just talking about that, and that has shifted the context, and there's pressure on political systems, there's pressure on conservation, there's pressure on people, and we are in a different situation from where we were 18 months ago. So the objectives, what we'd like to try and do today is to move forward the conversation about thinking and working politically in conservation, especially in the conservation standards community. So whether you're a member of CMP or CCNet, or you're outside that community, you're all very welcome. But we're looking forward to moving forward the conversation. And to do so, we'd like to give a brief overview of some publications that have been put out recently. And they're really at different scales and complementary. So the first publications were from CMP around navigating political risk and uncertainty. There was one done in 2019, which I'll just recap on briefly. Some of you might remember that one. And many thanks to those of you who've contributed to that study. And then Amma Marston will cover the 2020 report that was done, which really moved things forward and looked at things in a post-COVID or a COVID context. So those studies really focus primarily at the organizational level and reflect the practice and the situation in CMP and other conservation organizations, and also a little bit outside the conservation sector. And then that'll be followed by Heidi and Kelsey presenting the USAID guide on thinking and working politically and biodiversity conservation. And that focuses more on the project and program level and provides more specific how-to guidance, if you like, on how to do the thinking, working politically in the conservation standards type process. So we just felt that these two ways of coming at this topic were complementary and they should work together well. So we hope you'll really enjoy it. So and just to acknowledge, this is at least the CMP part, this first part, is one of the collaborative learning initiatives that has been funded by Moore. So we really appreciate that. And that's why it sort of follows on in the series. So as I say, I'm just going to recap briefly on the 2019 work. I won't go into too much detail. There is a recording of this available if you want a little bit more. You'll see what the 2019 study was about. It was about supporting conservation organizations to find ways to operate in an uncertain context. Just to say, so what did we mean by political risk? Well, there isn't necessarily a totally agreed, sorted definition, but for practical purposes, that study assessed political risk as an event or an act by government that creates uncertainty for achievement of objectives, whether that's a positive or a negative effect. And so, as I say, it focused on government and affiliated entities as the main contributor to political risk. It came out with a report, as I say, the link has already been provided, and it resulted from a number of interviews that AMA conducted and literature review and looked at various diverse situations. And you might possibly remember, if you saw the presentation before, you looked at that report, some of these ways that are on this slide to start thinking about political risk and uncertainty as a topic. So some of the issues around the scale that you might be thinking about, whether it's international, national, or local, and this concept of what we call big P and little p. So big P being more the sort of party politics, and little p, the more the power relations, the power brokers, and possibly relating into corruption as well. And we talked about chronic and acute type risks, the chronic ones being perhaps more ongoing, perhaps more predictable, typical of maybe dysfunctional government type situations, as opposed to the acute ones where things flare up and they're maybe hard to foresee. And we noted that organizations are quite varied in their engagement and preparedness. So some organizations have quite limited capacity to engage on these topics, whereas others are highly attuned, they've got quite a lot of capacity, and indeed they're actually trying to influence the political agenda. So within our community, we've got some quite varied situations that people are facing. We also touched in that report on some tools, those are listed there. You can get more details again in the report. You might remember that for those of you who joined the presentation or saw that report, that Amma went through on scenario planning, a renewable energy example from the US, where in that case there was a consortium of charities in the US, where in a situation where the federal government changed in 2016, we all remember that. And they had to develop, well, shall we say, in a response to a not conservation friendly type government, they had to develop scenarios and strategies in response to that change. And you'll see on the right some examples of pause and reflect type sessions. So that's those cycles there, and those short repeated cycles, those are intended to represent intentional pause and reflect type sessions. So that was another type of tool that some organizations are using. So that 2019 report just goes, it explains a little bit more detail, some of the tools that people are making use of. And we came out with some recommendations on things to do, useful things for organizations to do to help you move forward. And it was really pretty much left to organizations to pick things up, take advantage of these recommendations, use them as they wish. There's somewhat an aggregation of some of the useful things that seem to be coming out from the various organizations and individuals that were consulted in the report. And you'll see really it was about encouraging organizations to reflect on their structure, their way of operating, their exposure to political risk, their capacity situation and engagement on the topic, the networks that they have, are they prepared for situations that might arise, do they have processes for adapting, and maybe, as I say, just giving pointers to nudge organizations in a helpful direction. So that was just a recap of the 2019 report, really. And then we moved on to the 2020. So again, we got some support from the Moore Foundation to move forward a further study, which again, Amma coordinated and led on. And what we were looking to do, of course, things had moved on quite a bit by this point, and we had the COVID context emerging. It was still quite early days when we started talking about it. But we also sought, as well as putting the study or putting the assessment in this more specific COVID context, we were looking for some more diverse inputs in terms of both geography and types of organization. So Amma, with that, I'm going to hand over to you, and maybe you can take forward what we found, or what you found rather, in the 2020 study.
Sure. Thank you for that, Will. And in general, thank you for the opportunity to collaborate, including with many of you who are on the phone. Both these bodies of work kind of reflect that collaboration and what many of you have been doing, thinking about, reading, etc. So if, Will, would you just advance to the next slide? Thank you. So we set out and we were looking at what does political risk mean in the context of conservation, how do we adapt to uncertainty? And it was very abstract in some ways, or grounded in each of the separate realities of the folks that we talked to. And then all of a sudden, COVID comes along and throws us all into a storm worldwide. And while each of us have had different realities within that, it means that everybody has been grappling in different ways. And I think that it has tested this notion of, what is political risk? Can we isolate it to government behavior in defining it? And political risk has ended up looking very different. So for instance, talking to organizations where it's suddenly a political risk for them whether or not they give food aid to local communities that they partner with. That's not a kind of risk that people may have thought about before, because there wasn't a pandemic and their local partners weren't compromised in the same way. Also, we've seen a breakdown of democratic norms and institutions. So, political risk and thinking politically has looked very different. And part of that is that it's been hard to separate it out from economic, social issues. So everybody has been kind of thrown into the midst. This piece of work very much reflects that. So it's a reflection of what people have been doing as opposed to all the things that we could do. And I just want to congratulate everybody, given how much everything has been turned upside down. People and organizations have done very well in adapting, with the best that they have, some doing it kind of ad hoc, some thinking more systemically. So adaptability has been a key feature, again, for many of you around the world, as well as some additional experts. That's meant adaptability in terms of, getting everybody safe and out of the office, how to work online, all of the basics, as but also how do you carry out conservation and partnerships when you can't be in the field, you can't see people. What do you do when partners need support that is outside of your remit of work? And that has been one of the toughest questions, I think, for a lot of organizations, is finding that sweet spot of where they feel comfortable providing broader support because their partners need it, and it builds trust in that partnership, but also not becoming an aid organization. Having to work with funders and foundations to think about being flexible in terms of timelines, but also how organizations use the money, what they deliver. So there's been adapting in many, many ways. One of the things that we identified early on in this first piece of work was the extent to which relationships really allow for adaptability, resilience, thinking ahead in terms of political risk, working politically. And that turned out to very much be the case when, we were thrown into the fire. And the relationships have, one, allowed organizations to continue to work by kind of shifting some of the responsibility away from staff in international locations to relying on partners working very locally, especially those who are, members of the community where they live and work. So those relationships have been really important. There has been partnering between some of the conservation organizations and some of the more development and aid organizations, as well as health organizations, which has been really important in thinking about rounded support for partnership, and again, building that trust in moments of crisis. And then there's also a need, there's some existing experience with and a realization of a need for greater partnerships and relationships with diverse organizations that have diverse knowledge to get a better understanding of the complex landscapes we're living in that does incorporate, thinking and working politically, the social, the environmental, the economic landscapes. Many organizations, as I said, have been very adaptable, and I, applaud everyone for that. A lot of that, however, has not incorporated kind of refocusing around doing a strategic review and thinking about the bigger picture of, are we asking the right questions still? Is our theory of change still applicable in this new world? And that's totally understandable, especially when this work was carried out, which is already months ago. People were really in the thick of the fire and crisis. And some of what I call transformative resilience happens a little bit after you get your bases settled. But there is, I think, a need for that, particularly as things normalize, or we come into new realities, new normals, is kind of reevaluating, do our theories of change still hold? And that also means revisiting conservation models. So we've seen a lot of disruption, especially in communities that have given up certain kinds of livelihoods to then support, conservation parks or what have you, based on tourism, which was totally shut down by COVID. And that's part of what has required organizations to adapt quickly, to provide some immediate support. But there are already some leaders in this community that have started to advance that conversation about, do we have the right models for kind of moving away from extractive behavior and moving towards conservation, and how do we make sure that communities are not exposed by being overly invested in just one economic model linked to conservation. The disruption has also been an opportunity in many ways, which, given how much pain there's been linked to it, may seem funny to say. But organizations, one I'm thinking of in India, for instance, very quickly collaborated with a whole network of others to try and link the kind of conservation and development conversations and get some immediate support through their government work program that guarantees basic levels of work for, I think, 100 days. They also partnered in new platforms to advance conservation and development. So, with these shakeups, there have also been opportunities for influencing in new ways, partnering in new ways, and there's been a light shown on how much we also need to evolve and think about, the mindsets, the frameworks that we're using, the partnerships, the structures in this new world that we will now be operating. And some of that is drawing on the tools that we already have. Will already mentioned some of those from the first round of research. And we have seen some good use of some of those. There's definitely more depth that we could go into, or that you, as you practice, can go into and share knowledge. So maybe, Will, could you skip ahead? Oops, well, oh, there we go. So we're not going to go through these, but in this 2020 research, we've kind of laid out what the topics and the trends were that we pulled out of all of these conversations, how it links to political risk, because as I said, a lot of what people were doing was just adapting, trying to cover the basics. But it's important to think about how that links to working politically. Then we've identified key questions that you can ask. And then you don't see it in this slide, but there are also tools that can be helpful during this kind of questioning. So if you go to the paper, there's multiple pages of this table, which we won't go over now. Will, would you skip ahead again? So let me give one example before summing up about the tools. So, scenarios planning is something that people have been using for a while and have used very well and instinctively. That was true during COVID. Some of the large federated organizations used scenario planning in their financial outlook and, kept adjusting to see where funds were coming from, how they might have to adapt. Adaptive management tools that already exist. There's also, all sorts of planning tools that, again, we list. And then stuff like pause and reflect sessions, which can be really hard to undertake when you're kind of in the thick of things. But one organization in particular, which I won't name specifically, but they used pause and reflect at a really critical moment. And I think this demonstrates some of the best of what people have done through this crisis. So this is a global organization that came out with a policy based on their Asia offices that said, there shouldn't be a use of wet markets or wild animals in markets. And so they put out a policy, and then their partners or their staff in other parts of the world said, well, if you shut down the markets in our part of the world, you're shutting down the supermarket, essentially. And the way in which meat and animals are traded here doesn't have the same potential for spreading disease. So it raised the issue of how does this organization come up with policies and recommendations in global crises with different contexts. And for the first time in the history of that organization, they did a senior level pause and reflect session. And it was, people were hesitant or resistant at first, but it came up with some important new ways of working, very rapid response, passing information back and forth so that when they do come up with global policies in response to crisis, that it's a bit more well-rounded and takes into account different realities. So just one very good example of pause and reflect. To summarize before I hand over to our colleagues, this is a bit of, I guess, my reflection on the two pieces of work and what is possible as opposed to sometimes what we do in the heat of the moment, especially when we're still honing our skills. It's really critical to secure our foundations so that we can get beyond crisis mode. And that's a little bit of this, hierarchy of needs where Will showed the slide. You have to make sure that you're safe, your people are safe first before you can get to some of the greater needs or thinking about stuff like strategy and adapting that. That completely makes sense. Adaptability has been one of the most critical things in many different ways. So, ensuring that you're being adaptable with your staff and your teams, your partners, and also funders. This is, roles, how you work, where you work, being adaptable in mindsets and creative about how you might accomplish the same goals, or even if you have the right goals for the given moment. Again, reflecting on organizational structures and mode of operating and how that may expose you to political risk or, needing to work politically, but also what your assets are based on the kind of organization you are. We need collaboration across organizations and skill sets for having more nuanced views of political and social landscapes, as well as economic landscapes, particularly as the global environment becomes more disruptive and also more complex. And that requires partnerships and sharing knowledge. One area where I think that we all could do better is assessing if our theories of change still apply. And again, some of that is maybe this is where we come to now when we're not in as immediate of crisis. You know, it's a process of going through transformation and creating resilience and new ways of working from these disruptive moments. You know, but we also have to assess if our strategies can be sustained and will they be effective in this new context. And again, that's closely linked to our theories of change. And then just to encourage all of you to continue to share learning, continue the conversations, and continue to invite diverse groups of people in. One of the things that I didn't drill down into, but there has also been a whole related body of work, is around diversity and inclusion, equality, you know, how the crisis and political risk in general may affect men and women differently. You know, different communities like Indigenous people, people of color, you know, all of the kind of societal inequities and roles and biases that may exist that get exacerbated in these moments. So that is all that I'll say. I'm happy to answer questions later. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to collaborate with you all.
Great. Well, thanks so much. What an interesting presentation. I think we wanted the second part of our double header today is to share a new guide that Kelsey Schutler from Environmental Incentives and myself have worked on. I am Heidi Schutenberg, a Senior Marine Biodiversity Advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And the guide we are going to talk about can be accessed at the link that I'm putting in the chat box here. And can I ask, is it Will or Kelsey who will be moving the slides forward?
I think it's you, Kelsey.
Yes.
Okay, great. So Kelsey, let's go ahead to the next slide then. So I'm going to take you through the structure of this guide, give you a little tour de force, and then pass it over to Kelsey to highlight some key resources we've included in the guide. I just wanted to share, so our guide is technically strong and politically savvy, how to enhance thinking and working politically when implementing the conservation standards through the way we implement them at USAID, which is sort of a specific version of that approach. For those of you in the nuances of the conservation standards in Marathi, we have our own USAID language pack. That's how seriously we take it here. So the audience for this guide is USAID staff, but really implementers who are facilitating the conservation standards for us. And I'd be really interested to hear in the chat box if we have some conservation standards facilitators on the webinar live. If you facilitate situation models and results chains, would love to hear from you in the chat box. So I'm going to guide you through the 4 parts of the publication here next. So let's begin, Kelsey, on section 1 of the guide. We start off by defining thinking and working politically and making the case for why it matters to biodiversity conservation. And I think this builds really nicely on Amma's presentation. But essentially, thinking and working politically is an area of scholarship that has largely come out of international development. And it looks at understanding both the factors and the ways of working that influence human behavior and conservation results. So folks in this area of work often will use an iceberg analogy, that it could be that what you're seeing play out is the tip of the iceberg, but the forces that are influencing people using resources the way they do, maybe overusing resources, is influenced by a whole set of political factors that are represented by the part of the iceberg below the waterline. And P here is more the small p that Will talked about. So recognizing that human behavior often results from beliefs, incentives, power structures that are often unspoken and deeply rooted in culture, economics, personal dynamics and situations, as well as what we might think of as more typically political concerns. So on the next slide, we link this then to biodiversity conservation. And the image you see on your right is out of the 2019 IPBES report, which, probably the world's most robust analysis of the status of biodiversity and the drivers behind biodiversity loss. And if you look at those indirect drivers, we argue that that is very similar to the definition, the small p of thinking and working politically. So if these political factors are overwhelmingly driving biodiversity loss, then the case we make in the guide is it's pretty important for us to build these types of considerations with intention into our biodiversity conservation. And the guide is really focused on providing really practical tips for doing just that. So let's go to the next slide, Kelsey. So the second section of the guide starts in on how can you reveal your political context. Our first section there links you to a series of types of analyses and documents that can be useful in understanding some of those political dimensions. And then the second part, section 2.2, really focuses on the way you convene, recognizing that thinking and working politically is as much how you do things as sort of bringing in political ideas. And as we developed this guide, Kelsey and I held a number of focus groups. And one of the questions that came up again and again was, well, it can be quite difficult to talk about political information. How do you really create convenings where the participants feel safe talking about sensitive information? And so I want to give you an example from Ghana, which is the photograph on the right. And section 2 of the guide kind of lays out the types of tips that we use to try to create convenings that can be an example of working politically and help reveal your political context. So I work in fisheries. All my examples are fisheries. If you don't have enough fish in your life, we're going to take care of that for you this afternoon. But the first fisheries example here was a midterm point in this program. It was a high achieving program, but it's a very difficult context they're dealing with in Ghana. So this was a midpoint pause and reflect workshop. And the first thing we did is on the opening day, we had both very senior USAID staff and the chief of party open the workshop by letting everyone know that we knew they were high achieving, that this was not a performance review, and that while we were interested in hearing what was working, we were equally interested in hearing about what they were concerned wasn't working. So to really set the expectation that we wanted to get into the reality of things. Second thing we did is we were able to bring together, I think, about 10 local implementers who were each working on parts of this program. So we had terrific grassroots, really frontline knowledge of the issues, but each of them had been working on a small part of the problem. So we developed sort of a wall-sized, and this is just one part of it in the photo, results chain or map of their theory of change that kind of created the bigger vision for them of how they were all fitting together. And the third thing we did is the facilitation question we used, which ended up revealing some very important political insights that ultimately have significantly changed the strategy USAID uses for fisheries work in Ghana, was we asked them this, and we asked them about day 3 when we had built up some nice playful social capital with each other. But we said, all right, we know you're a very high achieving group. What is it that keeps you up at night? What is it that despite all the hard work you're doing, you're worried just, isn't going to be enough? And they revealed about 5 really important political insights that we followed up on through a political economy analysis and some other strategy work, but it's fundamentally shifted our approach there. And I think it was because they had this great local insight and they were able to talk very candidly. So next slide, Kelsey. So I know that conservation standards is a series of practices which different organizations implement differently. At USAID, we use situation models as a context analysis or a map of our problem, and we use results chains to map out our theory of change. So these are both just very structured kind of box and arrow diagrams that have the strength of being really explicit and really visually accessible to those who are using them. So if we go to the next slide, section 3 of the guide really tries to then think about, in very much from the perspective of a facilitator, how do we make sure that these tools are getting us the political attunement and political nuance we need to be effective, rather than kind of staying at surface level kind of technocratic issues. So I want to give you an example from Senegal for how this has played out, for example, in situation models or context analysis. And in this example, we were designing a new fisheries program in Senegal. We started off through a series of webinars with folks both in Senegal and in DC. And one part of a larger situation model where you map out the drivers as these orange boxes was we identified weak capacity for surveillance, enforcement, and prosecution as one of the reasons for overfishing in Senegal. And based on that understanding of weak capacity as a driver, our intervention or our strategic approach then was to strengthen capacity for enforcement. But we then on the next slide did a political economy analysis and then revisited our situation model with the insights we'd gotten from that more detailed look. And the situation model did affirm that, yes, there were weak capacities for surveillance and enforcement, but they added on that that was really a small part of what was really happening. And it became quite important through the facilitation to bring these broader factors into the context analysis. So through this work, we identified that there was also insufficient deterrence because there was political interference in prosecution, because the markets paid you the same amount, whether your fish was legal or illegal, that there was a real missed opportunity to engage influential community institutions in deterring illegal behavior, and that fish kind of provided the fastest cash for people in need, and there really wasn't another way for folks having medical emergencies or addressing school fees to get that kind of resource. So with this fuller understanding that we mapped out in our situation model, we changed our proposed strategic approach and what we called for in proposals to focus more broadly on strengthening both the incentives and disincentives for sustainable harvesting, which I think has enabled that program to be much more effective than if it had had the narrow focus on just capacity building for enforcement. And then on the next slide, and I think this dovetails nicely with one of Ama's examples, but here's a case where during a midterm pause and reflect in the Philippines, we were doing that check sheet question of, is your theory of change working or is it still working? So at USAID, we use these blue boxes, results chains. These are each showing an intermediate result to map out our theory of change. Little purple triangles are results that we try to measure. And what you're seeing here is a theory of change that goes like this, that if the provinces are providing technical assistance to the local government, and if the local government and stakeholders are using good information for fisheries management, then they're going to implement early fisheries management. And what they meant by that is essentially they were going to do some pilots. And that if they did these pilots, that was going to then, they use the term graduate into a fuller ecosystem approach to fisheries management program. But as we did the reflection on whether this was true, whether this was what was happening, we identified that we were not seeing graduation, that while we were seeing lots of examples of pilots, we were seeing very few examples of graduation. So the facilitation question here was, why? Why are we not seeing graduation as hypothesized by our theory of change? And so the next morning, a senior local implementer walked into the room and shared with us that he had had a shower epiphany, because we were really stumped on this in day one. And on the next slide, James shared with us that as he'd been thinking about it in the shower, that he realized that the places we were seeing graduation were places that in the process of the pilots, the program had built much more social capital and mobilized local leadership. And that they hypothesized in talking it through that that intermediate result was actually critical to whether or not the pilots blossomed into fuller programs. So the importance of being able to be explicit about this is the program also recognized it took a lot more resources to build social capital and mobilize resources, mobilize leadership. So as they were building that into their work plans and budgeting accordingly, it was important to be explicit about that, not just to have it as something that's nice to do in the background. And we took it so seriously that we decided it was really important to measure it as one of the interim monitoring variables, so we could test that hypothesis and see if see if implementation was on track, given how significant this seemed for getting the end scaling results we were looking for. And I just want to highlight that 1 second, that section 3.4 of the guide really does offer this sort of invitation or maybe challenge to, as you're monitoring, be willing to consider monitoring sort of latent variables, those things that are harder to measure, but really very important from the perspective of thinking and working politically. And then in the last section of the guide, on the next slide, we focus on collaboration, learning, and adapting. And the high-level message here is just that adaptive management is as much a political process as a technical one. And I think many of us intuit that the way we learn, the way we facilitate these processes is often more influential than the empirical rightness of any particular lessons learned study or evaluation. So this section of the guide tries to offer some suggestions on how to make that learning process influential through a TWP, a thinking and working politically lens. So with that, I would love to pass it over to Kelsey to flag a couple key resources we have included in the guide for you.
Thanks, Heidi. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to point out some of these resources in the guide, because I think they really get into the details of this work in a very concrete way. So the first resource that I wanted to share is Annex A, which is focused on common, what we call murky drivers that we encounter during problem analysis. And as Heidi mentioned, we had a series of focus groups that really illuminated that what makes situation models not TWP is the inclusion of drivers that are really hard to understand. So for example, words like corruption that don't give us a sense of what's the problem, how would we solve it? And this is what Heidi illustrated with that Senegal example of weak capacity. So Annex A helps facilitators get at something a little bit more specific to capture what's really going on. So for these common murky drivers that you see listed on the screen, like weak governance, lack of political will, there's some recommended probing questions in a flowchart form and some illustrative language to help facilitators succinctly capture some of these pretty complex concepts to make situation models more specific and politically informed. So at this point, you might be thinking, you know, it's great to know all of that, but what do I do? So the second resource that I wanted to share is Annex B, which really responds to this challenge that even when you get specific about the problem, it can be hard to identify solutions. And in many cases, strategic approaches focused on political drivers, they weren't obvious, or they felt maybe outside a team's manageable interest, and folks were more comfortable with technical solutions. So this resource takes a deeper look at approaches that are politically responsive, and it includes common problems, illustrative solutions, and resources. And the content is really meant to be illustrative and just provide inspiration to help teams generate new ideas. So For example, if you have defined a pretty decent driver, enforcement actions are ineffective because rule breakers are excused without consequences in exchange for political support. That's great. What do you do? And so Annex B has this example from the Philippines where they used technology to increase transparency and public trust through an SMS-based anonymous tip line that in its first 7 months led to 25 arrests, seizure of over 4,000 pieces of contraband, which was worth over $135,000. And people can also check what action was taken based on their tip. So this is just to illustrate the type of material that you can find as inspiration in Annex B. And then the final resource I wanted to highlight is just this running example throughout each section of the guide. And it's based on a hypothetical program to address illegal and unsustainable logging, improve livelihoods, and empower communities. And part of the reason that we wanted to include this in the guide is to make the concepts and guidance very tangible. So here I'm showing an example from the strategic approach section of the guide. And we have the before image, which illustrates an approach to strengthen government capacity around enforcement, which is fairly common. And then the example introduces some probing questions that a facilitator could use to explore whether the approach is addressing important political factors. And then we have an after as a contrast of what a more politically informed approach might include. So this is just meant to be really concrete examples illustrating these concepts at each stage of the conservation standards process. So those are the key resources that I wanted to highlight, and thanks for the opportunity to share these. Heidi and I also wanted to invite folks to share your experiences thinking and working politically with the conservation standards. We hope that this guide will be an iterative process and we can incorporate feedback and learn from others. So we have a short Google form that we'd love for folks to share and contribute their ideas and contact information so we can follow up. I think that's everything that I wanted to share. So I think I'll pass it back to Will, maybe to kick us off into questions.
Great, thanks ever so much, Heidi and Kelsey. That's really cool, and it's a very rich guide and resource, and you know, you could spend a good few hours really digging into that, and indeed hours and days using it. I've seen there's a bit of chat going on, for example, between David and Heidi going on in the chat. So David, do you want to just make any points? I mean, I'm conscious there's a lot of experience in the virtual room here of people working on these sorts of topics. So if anybody's got any particular experiences or as well as questions or comments to share, they'd be very welcome. So David, do you maybe just want to share a few thoughts or questions?
Well, one, marveled that you guys tackled this to begin with, because bloody hell, it's really, really difficult. And picking a really difficult problem in front of Paulina and saying, give us money to deal with that, I thought that was amazingly courageous. So really cool. I thought Amma did an amazing job of pulling together, gosh, such different and difficult contexts. Who would have known that Myanmar would have blown up and had another coup? How would you have prepared for that? How would you know that the US is pulling out of Afghanistan? How would you prepare for that? How would you know that Hong Kong, which was a commercially stable place for 75 years, suddenly becomes a basket case? How would you know and prepare for that? And I think that one of the things that we've learned, at least within WCS, is politicians change all the time. The technocrats within the ministries don't. And I think my USAID colleagues can agree with this. Many of my US colleagues have weathered multiple administrations, and at times they've popped their heads above the radar, and at times they've hidden below the radar, but they're still there 20, 30 years afterwards. And what at least WCS has learned, I think, is A, make friends with technocrats, make friends with politicians too, but most importantly, train people who were in your organization who then get hired as technocrats in government. If you're ever wanting to have political say or sway in places where things are unpredictable, having your friends being the technocrats in ministries is one of the most potent ways you can do that. But guys, you've done a great job, and I think that the guidance that you provided is extraordinarily useful. Thank you.
Cheers, David. That's really appreciated. Thank you on behalf of the group there. Any other questions or thoughts? There's a comment from Heidi that she'd love to hear experiences or challenges from anyone to where they've maybe been facilitating to bring out or respond to political factors, if people have got anything to say on that. I've got one question I wanted to put to Alma, which was just to follow up a little bit, if I may, Alma, maybe putting you on the spot a little bit, so deflect if you wish. But I did note on the report that you you talked about the importance of, or it was raised by people, the importance of mental mindsets as much as about tools. And I wondered if you'd like to just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, where to begin? I mean, I think that there are very specific conservation contexts, but the reality is that all of us working in conservation or political landscapes, what have you, we're humans, and that everything that follows, our analysis, our response, the initiatives we undertake, all of it kind of starts with mindsets. And I appreciated that this USAID research also points to that. And, so what do we do with mental models? It came up in different ways with experts in this group that I spoke to about, really problem solving and collaborating in new ways and being flexible thinkers. And how important that was, as opposed to some of the most technocratic responses, because people often want to start with technocratic responses or some of the stuff that seems most concrete and easiest to get to that's out here at the edges, when actually we need to kind of think about our underlying assumptions and the ways in which we're framing the issues that we're looking at or the challenges. If we flip them on their head, is there an opportunity in it? I think I mentioned that briefly. So I'm speaking very high level here, but I think you have to speak at that kind of mindset or mental model level to then be able to say, are we asking the right questions? Have we framed this in the right way? Is there a different way that we could be looking at this that then leads to, different analysis, different partnerships, different frameworks, different monitoring and evaluation and outcomes? Does that answer your question, Will?
Yeah, good. Thank you. And there's questions coming up in the chat as well. There's one from Charles Wiggins saying, were there any enabling conditions aside from mindset that contributed to some organizations being better able to adapt, do you think, than others, or working higher up the hierarchy pyramid than others? What factors prepared organizations better, do you think?
What factors better prepared organizations? We didn't get to dive into this to the extent that I would like, and that may be an area for continued work, especially as organizations come out of the crisis mode. But I do think a lot of it comes down to kind of leadership. Although different people can exercise leadership at different places in an organization, so it doesn't have to be, that somebody has the director role on their, door. But what prepares people? I mean, I guess having flexible thinkers, whether or not everybody in your team is a flexible thinker, having at least a couple people that are prepared to kind of seed a process of reframing, knowing that your bases are taken care of. So having a leader or someone in the organization that's making sure that you're safe and well cared for then frees up your ability to kind of think about, to step back and reflect on your mental models if you're in fight or flight mode and extremely stressed, you're not going to be able to look at the bigger picture. So unless you have an organization that's addressing your basic needs as someone working in that organization, you're not going to get to the reflection stage. I hope that helps,
Sure.
but it does seem like this could be an area of further kind of investigation once there's a little bit of distance from the crises that we've just been through.
Yeah, and more comments coming back from David in there, and also Estuardo. Paulina, you'd like to say something? Paulina? Are you muted, Paulina?
Yes, I was. Now I
Okay.
can. Can you hear me? I'm on my
Yes,
phone.
we can now.
No, I just wanted to reinforce, some of the other enabling conditions that I've seen that have helped organizations be more resilient to these political changes are having social scientists on staff, or even individuals who are more politically savvy and are constantly tracking these various political waves. In Brazil, when Bolsonaro came in, I mentioned this in the chat, it really threw off many of our partners because of the risks involved, both in confronting the political changes that were happening, but then also the risk of losing many of the gains that had been obtained over the last 15 years. But there's always individuals who had the ability to find the political windows of opportunity, or where you could find an ally that perhaps 5 years before wasn't an ally, but suddenly you have something in common because you have a common enemy. So finding these individuals, and also within the team, creating those conditions of discussion where you really think outside the box and find the allies that perhaps weren't visible or present in the past is certainly in the condition that has been favorable for some of our partners.
Thank you. And more comments coming up. So do you have a look at the chat, everybody? There's some really great comments coming through. And Sarah, I guess I'm just conscious of time, and one or two people are just starting to drop off now.
Mm-hmm.
So from my point of view, I just wanted to thank the group, everybody's been presented, and also everybody's contributed today, or whether you've managed to get any words in or just put them in the chat. Really appreciate it. But with that, I guess I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
And guys, one more time, well done on when you proposed it, Will. I thought, you're bonkers. That was an impossible task. Well, it turned out not to be. Well done.
Cheers, David.
Great. Well, that's a great comment to leave off on as well. Thank you so much to Heidi, Kelsey, Will, and Amma for your presentation today. It was fascinating. And as I mentioned before, this will be uploaded to the CMP YouTube channel, and I'll be sending a follow-up email to all of you with the recording, and also any extra information that the hosts want to share with you. If you look in the chat now, if you're still on, there's a Google form that you can fill out with some questions, and I'll also send that in the follow-up email too, so if you miss it, don't worry. But thank you so much to our presenters today, and be on the lookout for our next webinar, which I think will be featuring David Wilkie and his Conservation Social Science group. So there will be a next webinar. I believe that's on June 2nd. So I'll be sending out an email for that shortly. But thank you all for joining.
Great, thanks.